I'll never forget the night my mom and I got stranded on that desolate road, the night I learned just how dangerous people can be. It was the summer of 1997, and my mom had just accepted a teaching job in a tiny desert town we'd never heard of before. Moving was supposed to be exciting, a fresh start after my dad left us a few years back. But as we loaded our old sedan with everything we couldn't trust the movers with, a sense of unease settled over me. Something about the wide open sky and the endless stretch of road ahead felt ominous. We set out late in the afternoon, aiming to reach the new house by midnight. Mom was in high spirits, talking about how this job was going to change everything. I pretended to listen, but my eyes were glued to the scenery outside. The farther we got from the city, the more barren the landscape became. The sky was a dull orange as the sun set, casting eerie shadows over the scrubby desert plants. It was nearly 9 p.m. when it happened. The car started jerking, and the engine let out a horrible grinding noise. Mom cursed under her breath and pulled over. We both got out to check, though neither of us really knew what we were looking for. A quick glance at the engine made it clear we weren't going anywhere without help. "Looks like we're walking," Mom said with a forced laugh, trying to keep the mood light. She grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and slung her purse over her shoulder. "Let's find the nearest gas station." I wasn't thrilled about walking down a dark highway in the middle of nowhere, but I didn't have much choice. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating only a few feet ahead. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, and the silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the desert brush. About 20 minutes into our walk, we spotted headlights in the distance. Relief washed over me. Finally, someone who could help. The truck slowed as it approached us, and the driver rolled down his window. He was a wiry man in his 40s, with a cigarette dangling from his lips and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice rough. Mom nodded, explaining our situation. The man offered to give us a ride to the nearest town. Something about him felt off to me. Maybe it was the way his eyes lingered on me a little too long, or the way he kept shifting in his seat. But Mom, desperate and tired, thanked him and motioned for me to get in the back. As I climbed into the truck, my heart sank. The back seat was cluttered with tools and greasy rags, but that wasn't what scared me. There was an unmistakable smell, something metallic and sour, like rust and decay. I glanced at Mom, who was already in the passenger seat, too polite to notice or care. The man started driving, talking nonstop about random things, how he'd lived in the area his whole life, how he knew every back road and shortcut. His words made my skin crawl, but Mom kept nodding along, oblivious to the tension. Then he took a turn. Not onto a main road, but onto a dirt path that led deeper into the desert. "Shortcut," he said, flashing that unsettling grin again. Mom froze. "I thought you said the gas station was just up the road." "It is," he replied casually, "but this way's quicker. Trust me." I didn't trust him. My pulse was racing, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. Mom's hand clenched her purse tightly, her knuckles turning white. After a few minutes, the truck slowed to a stop. The man turned off the engine and twisted around in his seat to face us. "You two seem real nice," he said, his tone too friendly, "but I'm going to need you to step out of the truck." Mom's voice was steady, but I could hear the fear in it. "Why?" The man's smile faded. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Just get out." I was frozen, my mind racing. Then I saw a crowbar tucked under the driver's seat, partially hidden by the rags. Mom must have seen it too, because she suddenly grabbed my hand and whispered, "Run." Before I could process what was happening, she yanked the door open and shoved me out. I hit the ground hard, my knees scraping against the rocky dirt. Mom was right behind me, dragging me to my feet as we sprinted into the darkness. The man shouted after us, his voice furious, but I didn't look back. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but the adrenaline kept me moving. The flashlight was long gone, and the only light came from the sliver of moon above us. We didn't stop until we saw lights in the distance. A small diner, glowing like a beacon in the middle of nowhere. We stumbled inside, breathless and trembling. The waitress took one look at us and called the police. When the officers arrived, we told them everything. They found the man's truck a few miles away, abandoned. Inside, they discovered something chilling: duct tape, rope, and several knives. The man himself was never caught. Even now, all these years later, I can still hear Mom's voice whispering, "Run." It's a memory that haunts me, a reminder of how close we came to never making it out of that desert alive. When I was 19, I decided to escape the chaos of university life for a weekend by staying in a remote guest house. It was an old stone monastery perched high in the mountains, rented out to travelers during the off-season. The caretaker, a wiry man in his 70s, handed me a brass key and said with a faint smile, "You'll be the only one here. It's quiet." That was exactly what I wanted. The first evening passed uneventfully. The solitude was both refreshing and eerie. I read by the fire in the common room until late, the crackle of the flames my only company. Outside, the valley below was cloaked in mist, the world beyond invisible. I fell asleep to the faint sound of the wind curling around the stone walls. But the second night wasn't so peaceful. I woke around midnight to an odd sound. At first I thought it was part of a dream, but there it was again, soft, deliberate tapping. I lay still, trying to place the noise. It wasn't coming from the window or the walls, but somewhere deeper in the building. It didn't sound like the wind. My heartbeat quickened as the tapping became more distinct, like something sharp rapping against a hard surface. Curiosity, or maybe fear, compelled me to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the dark hallway. The cold hit me instantly, sharp and biting, as if the stone itself radiated frost. I followed the sound, which seemed to echo faintly, leading me toward the common room downstairs. Each step I took creaked, the sound amplified in the stillness. I reached the landing and shone my flashlight into the darkness below. The fireplace was dead, its embers cold, and the faint moonlight filtering through the windows cast eerie shadows. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded strange, hollow in the cavernous space. No response. I was about to head back upstairs when I saw it. A figure, tall and completely still, stood outside one of the windows. Its silhouette was faint against the faint glow of moonlight, but it was unmistakable. The figure wasn't facing me, it was facing the glass, as if peering inside. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out any details, but something about its stillness unnerved me. I stepped back instinctively, my foot catching the edge of the staircase. The sudden movement must have drawn its attention, because at that moment the figure's head turned sharply toward me. I froze, unable to move, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Then it was gone, vanished into the dark. I didn't wait to see where it went. I bolted upstairs, heart pounding so loud it felt like a drum in my ears. I slammed my door shut and shoved the small desk in front of it. There was no lock, so it was the best I could do. My mind raced as I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, maybe an animal, but deep down I didn't believe it. And then the sound started again. Tapping, this time outside my window. I didn't dare move closer. The small gap in the curtain was enough for me to see that same figure, standing in the snow below. It didn't move, didn't try to get in. It just stood there, staring up at my window. My fingers gripped the flashlight tighter, though I knew it was useless against whatever this was. Then the power went out. The sudden loss of light felt like a punch to the chest. My flashlight became the only source of illumination, its beam weak and flickering. The cold seemed to seep into the room, and I sat there, huddled in a corner, waiting for whatever was outside to make its move. But nothing happened. I must have fallen asleep out of sheer exhaustion, because I woke to pale daylight streaming through the window. The figure was gone. I stayed in my room until the caretaker knocked on my door, announcing breakfast. I packed my things instead. When I came downstairs, he was standing by the doorway, watching me with an odd expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his tone strangely amused. I didn't respond. I wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. Before I left, I glanced outside, half expecting to find footprints in the snow. But the yard was pristine, undisturbed, as if no one had been there. I drove down the winding mountain road, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. I didn't look back, not even once. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that guest house. I've never spoken to anyone about it, not even my closest friends. All I know is that something or someone was there that night, and whatever it wasn't human. I still remember the sound of the bell tower as it struck noon, echoing through the empty streets of the old mining town. My cousins and I had been exploring all morning, daring each other to climb the crumbling walls of abandoned buildings or peek inside boarded-up windows. It was a strange place, frozen in time, where nothing moved except the occasional gust of wind that stirred the dust. We weren't supposed to be there. The sign at the entrance had been clear danger. Unstable structures, keep out. But curiosity won over caution. The town was a maze of leaning houses, rusted rail tracks, and forgotten stories, and it felt like we had the whole place to ourselves. By the time the sun began to dip, we were deep in the heart of the town. "Let's check out the mine," my cousin Nicky suggested, pointing to a dark tunnel at the edge of a steep hill. The entrance was framed by rotting wooden beams, and a single rusty cart sat derailed nearby. "Are you crazy?" I said, though I knew it was pointless. Nicky lived for this kind of stuff, always pushing the limits, always dragging us along with him. My younger cousin Jake was already following him, wide-eyed but silent as usual. I hesitated for a moment before sighing and trudging after them. The air grew colder as we stepped inside. The light from the entrance quickly faded, leaving only the dim glow of our flashlights bouncing off the rocky walls. It smelled damp, like wet earth and rust. The deeper we went, the narrower the passage became, forcing us to walk single file. Every sound, our footsteps, our breathing, even the occasional drip of water felt amplified in the confined space. At first, it was just exciting. The thrill of being somewhere we weren't supposed to, the eerie silence broken only by our muffled laughter. But then, things started to feel off. About 20 minutes in, Nicky stopped abruptly, holding up his hand for us to be quiet. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I strained my ears. At first there was nothing, just the usual echoes. But then, faintly, I heard it, a rhythmic tapping, like metal striking stone, coming from somewhere deep ahead. "It's probably just water dripping," I said, trying to sound confident. But Nicky shook his head. "No, it's too steady for that. Let's check it out." I didn't want to go further, but Nicky was already moving, and Jake followed him like a shadow. I had no choice but to keep up. The tapping grew louder as we walked, and my unease deepened. It felt deliberate, like someone was waiting for us to find them. We turned a corner and entered a wider chamber. Our flashlights illuminated piles of debris, broken tools, shattered beams, and a rusted rail cart tipped on its side. The tapping had stopped. "See?" Nothing, I said, hoping we could leave. But Nicky was already scanning the room, his flashlight catching something on the far wall. "Look," he said, pointing. It was a door. Heavy and metallic, partially hidden behind a collapsed support beam. It looked out of place, too modern compared to the rest of the mine. "Let's open it," Nicky said, stepping toward it. "Are you serious?" I snapped. "We don't even know if it's safe in here." But Nicky ignored me. He gripped the handle and pulled. The door groaned but didn't budge. Jake joined him, and together they heaved until it finally gave way with a deafening screech. Behind the door was a staircase, spiraling downward into total darkness. "This is insane," I said, backing away. "We need to leave. Now." But Nicky was already descending, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. Jake hesitated, glancing back at me, but when Nicky called his name, he followed. I stood there, torn between my growing fear and the thought of leaving them alone. With a muttered curse, I went after them. The staircase seemed endless, each step colder than the last. When we finally reached the bottom, we found ourselves in another tunnel, but this one was different. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and faintly glowing lines ran along the floor like veins of some strange mineral. "What is this place?" Jake whispered. Nicky didn't answer. He was too focused on the end of the tunnel, where the lines converged into a faintly pulsing light. We followed him, our footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. The air felt heavy, pressing against my chest with every breath. The tunnel opened into a massive cavern. At the center was a machine, a towering structure of gears, cables, and spinning lights. It looked ancient and futuristic at the same time, as if it didn't belong to any era or place we knew. "What the hell is this?" I breathed. Before anyone could answer, the tapping started again, louder this time. It was coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from everywhere. Then, one by one, lights began to flicker on around the cavern, revealing figures. Dozens of them. They weren't human. I don't know how to describe them, even now. They looked like they were made of metal and stone, their bodies angular and sharp, their faces blank except for glowing eyes that locked onto us. One stepped forward, its movements unnervingly smooth. Leave it said in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar. We didn't need to be told twice. Nicky dropped his flashlight and bolted, Jake close on his heels. I was right behind them, my heart hammering as the tapping grew deafening, chasing us up the stairs and through the mine. I didn't look back, not even when the sound stopped. When we finally burst out into the open air, it was night. The town was silent, the bell tower looming in the distance. We didn't speak as we stumbled back to our bikes and pedaled home as fast as we could. To this day, none of us talk about what we saw. I don't know what that place was or what those things were, but I know one thing for sure: we were never supposed to find it. It happened 10 years ago, during my last year at university. My roommate Alex and I were living in this old, crumbling apartment above a bookstore in the heart of the city. The place had charm, sure, but it also had its quirks, creaky floorboards, a draft that always made the windows rattle, and walls so thin you could hear the neighbors sneeze. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was enough. One Friday night, we decided to stay in. The semester had been grueling, and neither of us felt like braving the cold to hit the bars. Instead, we grabbed some snacks, queued up a bad horror movie, and settled in for a lazy evening. The only sound outside was the occasional rumble of a passing tram. Inside, it was just us, our laughter, and the hum of the old radiator struggling to keep the place warm. Around 9 p.m., Alex got up to grab another beer. As he walked into the kitchen, he stopped abruptly. "Did you leave the back door unlocked?" he asked, his voice sharper than usual. I frowned. "No, I haven't touched it since I got home." "Well, it's open," he said, staring down the dark hallway that led to the back of the apartment. The words sent a chill through me. The back door opened onto a fire escape, and while we'd had a few break-ins in the neighborhood, our building was usually quiet. I joined him in the kitchen, and sure enough, the door was ajar, swaying slightly. Alex flipped the lock and muttered something about the wind. But I could see it in his face. He was just as unsettled as I was. We tried to shrug it off and went back to the movie, but the mood had shifted. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes felt louder, sharper, more intrusive. Halfway through the movie, Alex paused it and tilted his head, listening. "Do you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" "Footsteps," he whispered. I strained my ears. At first I didn't hear anything, but then, faintly, I caught it, a soft, rhythmic creaking coming from upstairs. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The thing is, we didn't have an upstairs. The apartment above ours had been empty for months, ever since the elderly tenant passed away. We exchanged a nervous glance. "Maybe it's just the building settling," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Building settling doesn't pace back and forth," Alex shot back. He grabbed a flashlight from the counter, and before I could stop him, he was heading toward the hallway. I followed, every muscle in my body tense. We climbed the narrow staircase that led to the upstairs apartment, the flashlight beam bouncing off the peeling wallpaper. The door at the top was shut, but as we got closer, we realized it wasn't locked. Alex hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. "If someone's squatting up here, we're calling the cops," he whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. He pushed the door open, and the beam of the flashlight swept across the dark room. It was completely empty, no furniture, no signs of life, just dust and shadows. But then we heard it again, footsteps coming from somewhere deeper inside the apartment. "Hello?" Alex called out, his voice trembling slightly. No response. The footsteps stopped. We crept further inside, the floorboards groaning beneath our weight. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the room itself didn't want us there. We reached the far end of the apartment, where a single door stood slightly ajar. Alex pushed it open with a flashlight, revealing a small, empty bedroom. There was nothing there, no one. Just an old mirror propped against the wall, its glass cracked and clouded with age. Alex shone the flashlight on the mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move, a shadow that wasn't ours, shifting just beyond the edge of the reflection. I grabbed his arm. "Let's go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't argue. We backed out of the apartment, locking the door behind us, and practically ran down the stairs. Back in our own apartment, we double-checked all the locks and sat in the living room, trying to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. About an hour later, as we were finally starting to relax, the sound returned. But this time, it wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from the hallway outside our door, slow, deliberate footsteps, moving closer. We froze, staring at the door. The footsteps stopped, and there was a soft knock. Neither of us moved. Then a voice, low and quiet, barely audible through the door. "Can you let me in?" It sounded almost familiar, but something about it was wrong. It wasn't quite human, like someone trying to mimic a voice they didn't fully understand. Alex shook his head, his eyes wide. I couldn't bring myself to speak. The doorknob rattled, but the lock held. After a few tense moments, the sound stopped, and everything went quiet. We sat there for hours, too scared to move, until the first light of dawn seeped through the curtains. When we finally worked up the courage to check the hallway, it was empty. The locks were intact, and there were no signs that anyone had been there. But on the floor, just outside our door, was a single wet footprint. We moved out 2 weeks later. When I was 13, my uncle asked me to watch over his small corner shop for an evening. It wasn't a glamorous job, but he paid well, and I liked the quiet. His shop was a tiny, one-room building tucked between a laundromat and a rundown barber shop on the edge of town. It mostly sold snacks, soda, and magazines, and it rarely got much foot traffic after dark. That night started out uneventful. I sat behind the counter, flipping through an old comic book, occasionally glancing up when someone wandered in for a bag of chips or a pack of gum. The hum of the flickering neon sign outside was oddly soothing, and the street beyond the shop windows was almost empty, except for the occasional car passing by. Around 9 p.m., things got strange. I was restocking a shelf when I heard the bell above the door jingle. "Be right there." I called out, wiping my hands on my jeans as I headed back to the counter. But when I got there, no one was inside. The door was shut, and the street outside was empty. I shrugged it off. Figuring it must have been the wind, or maybe the door hadn't latched properly, I double-checked the lock to be safe and went back to restocking. Not even 5 minutes later, the bell jingled again. This time I moved faster, spinning around to face the door. Again, no one was there. The air felt heavier now, and the shop's usual coziness suddenly seemed stifling. I told myself it was just my imagination, a side effect of being alone in a place that was eerily quiet. Still, I decided to stay behind the counter. I pulled out my phone to distract myself, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to swing open. Instead, I heard something else, a faint scraping sound coming from the back storage room. My chest tightened. The storage room didn't have an entrance. It was just a small space crammed with shelves of inventory, and no one else had the key except me and my uncle. I stared at the door, willing the noise to stop, but the scraping continued, slow and deliberate. I grabbed the heavy flashlight my uncle kept under the counter. It wasn't much, but it was the closest thing to a weapon I could find. Swallowing my fear, I crept toward the storage room door. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. The scraping stopped. I stood there for a moment, gripping the flashlight, my heart hammering in my chest. Then, as I reached for the doorknob, something banged against the other side of the door hard. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The noise was followed by silence so complete it made my ears ring. That was enough for me. I locked the storage room door and hurried back to the counter. My hands were shaking as I called my uncle. He answered on the second ring. "What's up, kiddo?" he said, his voice casual. Is anyone else supposed to have access to the shop tonight? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. No, why? There's something in the storage room, I stammered. I don't know what it is, but I didn't get to finish. The sound of glass shattering cut me off. I spun around to see the front window shattered. Shards of glass glittered on the floor and cold air rushed into the shop. Call the police, my uncle said, his tone immediately serious. Lock yourself somewhere safe until they get there. I dropped the phone and bolted toward the small restroom near the back of the shop. I locked the door behind me and crouched in the corner, clutching the flashlight like my life depended on it. Outside, I could hear heavy footsteps crunching over the broken glass, moving slowly through the shop. My breathing was shallow, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. The footsteps stopped outside the restroom door. A shadow passed under the gap, and then the doorknob rattled. I held my breath, praying the lock would hold. For a moment, nothing happened. Then whoever it was began tapping on the door softly, methodically, like they were trying to unnerve me. It worked. The tapping stopped and the shadow moved away. I stayed frozen in place, too scared to move, until I heard the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. Moments later, the shop's doorbell jingled again, followed by the unmistakable voice of a police officer calling out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" I opened the restroom door cautiously, my legs trembling as I stepped out. A young officer stood in the middle of the shop, his flashlight sweeping over the broken window and scattered inventory. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, too shaken to speak. He checked the rest of the shop, including the storage room. When he came back, he looked puzzled. "There's no one here now, but there are footprints leading away from the shop. Whoever it was is gone." I told him everything, but there wasn't much he could do. He stayed until my uncle arrived, and together they cleaned up the glass while I sat in the corner, still clutching the flashlight. To this day. I don't know who or what was in the shop that night. Was it a prank gone too far? An attempted robbery? Or something else entirely? Whatever the case, I never volunteered to watch the shop again.